Alright, so in today's video I'm going to go through my process of cutting and painting and installing these baseboards, which I think came out really cool with the final product, but I'll be curious to get your thoughts on what you think of this design. Overall it's made of 3 different parts. There's this main whiteboard, which is 5.5 inch tall by 3/4 inch thick material. It is spruce, I believe. I got it from Lowe's. I got the 12-foot lengths. And then there's this top black strip piece that is also cut of that same material. And that is cut down to 1-inch strips on the top. And there's this bottom section, which is also 3/4 of an inch tall, but cut to strips of 1/4 inch thick. So I'm just going to go through my process of how I completed this section for the most part, and I repeated that process throughout the whole house. And I'm also going to share some of the challenges and mistakes I made with this particular design and some of the solutions that I came up with. So I'll be curious to hear from you all if there are better ways of doing this or easier fixes to some of the mistakes I made. But please let me know in the comments, and hope you enjoy.
Testing. Alright, so first step of this project was to get my materials ready to go and painted, and here I'm just spraying down the boards I'm going to be using for the baseboards with some white paint. Still getting the hang of the sprayer, still getting those paint tails. And I mentioned before I'm also going to be using that same material for the top strip pieces, so here I'm going to rip the strips out on my table saw. The setup here is I'm using that yellow featherboard thing to keep the boards into the fence as I'm pushing it through. And I also clamped a 2x2 board to keep the board down as I'm pushing it through. Because the boards are 12 feet long, it's kind of tricky to handle the board and get the cuts repeatable and accurate, so the setup was pretty important. I'm actually only cutting off 2 strips from each board, and I'm going to use that residual offcut for the door casings I'm eventually going to put up. So here I am spraying down the trim boards that I just ripped down. The sprayer I'm using is the Graco X5, and the spray tip I'm using is the 310 fine finish tip with a 2-foot extender on the sprayer. All this gear and additional add-ons to the paint sprayer make the job a lot easier and a lot faster. So once the materials were ready to go, I removed the old baseboards with a pry bar and scraped all the caulk off with that scraper. It was time to get to installing.
So whenever possible, I actually just like to bring the full-size board into the gap I want to cover and mark it off by hand. Could use a measuring tape, but this just makes it pretty simple and pretty guaranteed about the fit. So I'm just butting it up against the wall, marking off right where my casing ends, and I'm just going to go make my cut. Because I don't have any kind of decorative profile in this baseboard, it's just a straight 3/4 inch board. I'm not going to miter the corners. I'm actually just going to butt them up in the corner just to make my life a little easier. So when I go to nail this board in, it's going to create this tiny little lip here that I want to avoid when possible. What I can do is just put a little tiny shim here from scrap wood and place that in the back of the joint here. Alright. That looks pretty good to me. And then from there I'm just gonna find my studs with a stud finder. If there's a little gap down here, I'm just going to push it down as I nail it before I nail it in.
So I'm finishing up all my inside corners with some caulk. And I'm using a pretty generous amount of caulk here because I don't want that joint to crack over time. So I'm just putting it on and shaping it with my finger, kind of rounding it out from the corners. For the areas where the 12-foot board didn't cover the whole run, I joined 2 boards together here with my domino joiner. Although I will say not necessary at all, you can definitely just have them butt up against each other and nail them in. Although it would probably look better if you used a 45-degree cut. And here I'm just going to show a couple examples of areas where I had to modify the board slightly to fit around certain obstacles. So in this case, I used my track saw to cut out a chunk to fit around this heater vent. And then I also had this situation where I had a cabinet to cut around. So I just took my measurements and traced out my cut, and I cut that part out using my miter saw.
So for my corners, because I have rounded over corners, I can't just cut this at a 45 degree because it's going to leave a little gap in the front that I don't want to have. So I've cut out these transition pieces, which are cut at 22.5 degrees on both sides and about 1 1/8 inches on this outside edge. The tricky part is finding the exact spot where this is going to be so that it lines up correctly with the 2 outside boards. So for this board and this board, they also are going to be cut at a 22.5 degree angle. So when they meet up, they're going to be flush with each other as it's turning the corner. So basically what I'm going to do, I just have a scrap board here that has that 22.5 degree angle, and I'm going to just sneak up on where the exact spot is to where this edge here is flush, and I'm applying pressure in on both boards. So if I'm too far back, it's going to be jutting out too far from this piece. If I'm too far forward, that angle is going to come out from the bottom. So I'm just finding that sweet spot in the middle, and it's about right there. Where the outer edge of that is, and the outer edge of this is. So now for this board, I'm going to measure the distance from here, from this mark to my edge, and same thing with this board going back this way.
So I cut all these pieces out on my miter saw, just setting my cut angle at 22.5 degrees. It's a pretty essential tool for a project like this. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually pre-assembling this pillar section using some CA glue. It's a 2-part glue where you put the bead on, and then you use this spray activator, and it basically makes it harden in about 5 to 10 seconds. The reason I'm pre-assembling this is because if I had just nailed on each little piece individually, there's a very good chance that the boards would go on uneven and those joints wouldn't line up the right way. So pre-assembling it takes that out of the equation and moves any imprecision to behind the board.
Okay, let's see, moment of truth. Oh, it doesn't quite fit. I'm gonna just try and force it anyway. It's probably gonna break one of the joints. Oh shoot. Alright, well, this one down here broke. But we can fix that still. This one held up pretty good. I think what I'm gonna do, just to flatten out this tiny little lip, you can take the edge of a screwdriver and just very lightly flatten that out. Very lightly. Not applying much pressure at all. You don't want to point too much. Okay, that's it. That one looks good to me. Alright, that looks pretty good to me. Pressure on this joint there. Alright, not too bad. Not too bad. Anything wider than that gap that I had there, and I probably would just try and recut it, honestly. But that kind of a size crack I can work with. So to fill my nail holes, I'm using this Dry Dex spackling, the pink stuff. Just rub some in there.
So after I got all the boards on the wall for all my corners, all my runs, for this main baseboard piece, it was time to touch everything up, make everything look pretty. It's a pretty tedious and arduous process, but it makes all the difference in the world. So this involves filling all my nail holes with some spackle, caulking up any cracks I see, and then touching everything up with some paint to get that final nice crisp look. And as I said earlier, I'm putting a pretty generous amount of caulk in these cracks because I don't want to see them crack over time. And I'm really just using my finger to smooth it out, and also smoothing it out with a wet rag. A couple tips on caulking. It's not rocket science, but definitely is easier to have that wet rag around to clean up any excess or get it off your fingers. Also, the caulking gun makes a difference. If you use the cheaper ones, they basically keep the handle down the whole way and it sprays out a bunch of excess. So find the more expensive one that releases the press. And finally, always cut your tips at 45 degree. That way it comes out a little cleaner and more predictable. I had this scenario too where I just could not get the baseboard to line up with the door casing, so I thought it'd be a good idea to chisel out that little lip. I think it came out okay after I painted it, but in the future I would probably just try and shape it with some caulk instead of trying this. So this top trim section, I'm taking 2 scrap pieces that are cut at 22.5, and I'm going to try and get the marks here for this corner. So what I'm going to do is just hold this tight against this side, hold this tight against the corner, and I'm just going to slowly work my way until the joint looks flush and this tip matches. So right, maybe back a little bit, right there. So again, just cut these pieces out on my miter saw at 22.5 degrees. I'm actually just going to nail them in individually with my pin nailer instead of reassembling it. It's less risk of them actually becoming out of alignment here. So it's pretty good. So at this point, I just want to mention, if you found any of this useful or helpful, or if you find it entertaining in any way, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's absolutely huge as far as motivating me to continue to make videos. It goes a long way in helping me grow the channel. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I've given up trying to make this some work. Yeah, I couldn't get these all to line up perfectly every time. Here I'm just cutting off a little lip that was protruding with my multi-tool. Still think it looks fine doing that. You can't really see the joints once it's all painted up. So for the very last piece of trim here on the bottom, I'm just using my pin nailer as well. These again are cut at 1/4 of an inch thick and they're 3/4 of an inch tall. And same exact process as the other 2 pieces, so I'm measuring the corners, cutting them all at 22.5 degrees, and just mounting them here. So I'm using a pin nailer here because it creates a lot smaller holes than a brad nailer. So small that you can't really see them with your naked eye, so there's no need to have to go back and fill in the holes and touch them up with paint or anything like that. And there's enough holding power that I don't think this trim is going to be moving anytime soon. As I was installing this, I was definitely happy that I decided to do this because of the gaps that I was seeing from the bottom of the baseboard to the floor. Just happens over longer runs. The laminate in the subfloor was slightly uneven. I didn't want to have to go back and shave off any of the bottom of the baseboards to get it to sit flush with the floor. So this was definitely a helpful piece of trim to add. So after I got all the trim on, the last step here is just to put a bead of caulk in there. And with that, the baseboards were done. Just a couple quick call outs here. I did continue that top trim piece into the door casing, so cutting at 45-degree angle there. And I did end that bottom strip on a 45 just to give it that ending touch. So it's easy to say, hey, it's just baseboards. But to me, it's a lot more than that. This speaks to lifestyle. This speaks to my own craftsmanship and who I am as a person, and how I choose to approach things, and where I'm going to go in the future. Nah, it's just baseboards.
Installing these baseboards throughout the house. Alright. Alright, so in today's video, I'm going to go through my step-by-step process of cutting,